Hi all. This is Bridget here. Thank you so much for joining today. I apologize for being a bit late. We were having some technical difficulties getting the webinar to connect, but hopefully you can all hear me now. Um, I We have about 12 people on. I'm just sending a message in the chat box um, to make sure people are able to use it and see me. And I wanted to hopefully just go through who's on the call, since we have about 13 people, I believe, just to get a sense. And similar to last time, maybe you can just say your name if you were able to join us at the first part of this two-part series, and whether or not you're headed to the upcoming COP meeting. So I'll start and go ahead. I hope everyone can hear me, but I'm Bridget Burns. I am the co-director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and also the co-focal point of the Women and Gender Constituency, and have been attending the UNFCCC processes for several years now. And as said, this is the second part of a two-part series of webinars. Last time we went through some of the history of the UNFCCC and how a lot of the themes have evolved in terms of how they're discussed, including the issue of gender. And today, I'll discuss a little bit more what we'll do today. So I wanted to see if others we can make sure everybody's mics work. Perhaps starting with Ira. So I'm not sure if I've muted everyone, but I'm going to unmute everyone at the moment. So Ira, are you there?
Yes.
Hi. Could you just introduce yourself and let us know if you are planning to attend the upcoming meeting?
Yes, Bridget, I'm Aira Kalela in Finland, and I have been working with the Global Gender and Climate Alliance, particularly with WEDO, for the last 8 years, and I'm planning to come to Marrakech.
Thank you, Ira. Kansu?
Hello everyone. I'm Jansu, and I'm now doing a traineeship in the European Parliament in the Green Group, and I will be in Marrakesh.
Great. Celia?
Hi everyone, my name is Celia. I'm currently in Minneapolis and I work for a Partnership for Change, a Norwegian NGO focusing on the environment and gender, and I will be in Marrakesh.
Fantastic, Celia. Chiara?
Hi, I'm Chiara. I work for Italian Climate Network. We created last year a section dedicated to women's rights and climate justice. And I'll be in Marrakesh from the second week from the 12th.
Great, thank you so much. And Devi?
Hi, this is Devi. I'm the co-director of Frida, the Young Feminist Fund. I actually already live in Morocco, so I will be in Marrakesh just for a couple of days. To be honest, it's kind of a new space for me, but looking forward to meeting you all.
Thank you, Devi. Fatia, I'm not sure if you can, it doesn't seem that you have a mic on, so I hope you can hear us. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat box, because I don't think we can hear you. So then I'll move on to Kate. Kate Cahoon. I'm not sure if Kate can hear us. It seems like she might also be muted. So then, Lena?
Hi everyone, my name is Lena. I work in UK for a non-for-profit organization called KEBI, and I work on a global program in agriculture called Plantwise. I won't be attending the COP this year, but I was interested to learn more about gender and climate change and all of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Lena. Mahandra?
Hi. Yeah, my name is Majandra. I'm based in Peru. I'm a fellow with the Women's Environment and Development Organization and also Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, and I'll be in Morocco for the second week.
Thank you, Mahandra. And Nikki?
Hi everyone, my name is Nikki. I'm a PhD student at Ghent University doing my research on gender and the Rio Conventions, and unfortunately I won't be in Morocco for the COP, but I'm interested, I want to keep on top of what is happening or going to happen.
Thank you, Nikki. Patricia? Patricia? Okay, and Yasin? Not sure if Yasin can hear us. Okay, but that's okay. I'm going to just put everyone on mute again, and I really would encourage you, please, if you would like to share anything, there's a couple of functions that you can use through this GoToWebinar forum. You can raise your hand by pressing the hand button, which you'll see next to your name if you have a question. And just to go over a little bit last time, and I apologize, we had a little bit of trouble downloading the recording from the last session, which we have now. And so after this session, we'll be able to share the recording of both last week and this week. And as I said last week, we really went through some of the nitty-gritty of the UNFCCC process. So what the history of the convention itself is, what the evolution and themes have been, and also we went through just the day-to-day meeting schedule of what being at a UN climate negotiations is like. And so if there's any of you who are not on that call and whose first time it is attending the UN negotiations, it might be a very interesting one for you to look at and to see the recording of. For this session, it's intended to be a bit more interactive, and we're going to dive a bit deeper into the actual issues being discussed at the upcoming COP. I want to share with you a few tools that we've created to sort of help guide people through the sort of inside process and what's happening, and how as the constituency in particular, we are going to try to focus and delegate work amongst each other in terms of giving interventions, for example. And then I also wanted to share and go through a little bit with you what the Women and Gender Constituency's key demands are. So both in terms of some of the key process pieces, as well as more broadly going into the negotiations. So I was hoping we could start with doing an overview of the framing of the Women and Gender Constituency and what our key demands are as we move into COP22. And I know that Kate Cahoon is also on the call from the constituency. I'm going to unmute for a second to see if maybe she's able to speak now, because she wasn't able before. Kate, are you there? So I hope that Kate would help me to facilitate some of this piece on the constituency's key demands, but I think she might be having some trouble with her. I'm going to leave her unmuted, but I think she might be having some trouble with her ability to contribute to the call. So I'm just going to share my screen with you, and it would be great if you could let me know if you're able to see on the screen the Women and Gender Constituency demands for human rights, justice, a sustainable future for all. Can someone just write in the chat box if they're able to see that? I see a hand raised. Is that Chara, are you saying that you can see it? Is that why your hand is raised, or did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. No, it's just that like last time I write in the chat, but you cannot see me. So I wanted just to say that I was seeing you. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why I can't see what people are writing in the chat box, but thank you for letting me know. Okay, so I'm gonna move into then, I guess, a big picture and how we're thinking about the upcoming climate negotiations. And so the Women and Gender Constituency, which some of you may know is one of the 9 constituencies that make up the UN Climate Convention. And these are the constituencies alongside trade unions, indigenous peoples, farmers, youth. It's a way of organizing civil society inputs into this space to ensure a number of diverse voices are being heard. And so as a constituency, I also had been sharing earlier our website, which is womengenderclimate.org, and you'll be able to find some key events as well as these demands on that space. We've been working on thinking about what are our broad demands for the upcoming negotiations. So you may know that there's some specific decisions and areas of the negotiations which deal specifically with women's rights and gender equality, which we will get to at the end. But we also, as a constituency, try to think about the broad framing of the negotiations and what we think will ensure a gender just and a climate just outcome in terms of implementation. So these are pieces that we've been working on. We have several demands in relation to finance. There's a compendium document to this, I should say, which I will also show as well. And it goes a bit more, once we've outlined, here's the broad demands, we go a bit more in depth into what are the documents that are being put forward, what are the decisions that are being taken that we need to try to influence. So I'm just going to go through this one by one, and I would appreciate if there's any questions if people just ask. I'm going to pause at the end before we get into the discussion on gender to allow for others to contribute and to question any one of these pieces if they need more information. So in relation to finance, one thing that has recently happened, and obviously since the Paris Agreement was decided, one of the challenges has been that developing countries have called for and need developed countries to outline what the roadmap is to get to 100 billion a year, which developed countries have committed to. And so there's been that commitment on paper, but not necessarily an understanding of what the actual numbers are going to be from countries, what the commitments are, and what those commitments will go towards. And so at the recent ministerial, which was held by the government of Morocco with some of the ministers, following that ministerial, countries released this roadmap for 100 billion. So this roadmap is available for all of you to review. We have the links that we can share with you. And in our estimation of this roadmap, the roadmap itself, while welcomed in terms of finally being able to see what developed country commitments are, it is extremely inadequate in terms of actually meeting the demands and the challenges that we face in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation. So we know from the beginning that 100 billion isn't a scientific number and doesn't really reflect the need that developing countries have in terms of being able to meet their adaptation needs in particular, but also to meet their development and climate mitigation needs. And so we see COP22 as a really important time for countries to think about, really importantly, how we deal with this finance gap, how we stop in particular the narrative that we are going to delegate finance and climate finance by leveraging the private sector. How do we really articulate public funding and public money being put forward to support climate action? And so it's a recognition that this roadmap is not enough and a demand that there be much more done to raise ambition at this COP. And then the second piece of this, which is actually related very much to the first piece, because part of the challenge of not having this money to implement, for example, nationally determined contributions, is that where in which gender has been reflected in these contributions, and where there are plans to try to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, we don't have the financing to actually invest in those plans and policies. And so our other demand is that climate finance itself must be 100% gender responsive. And so we know that there's been a lot of work done to make sure the climate financing mechanisms have policies put in place to make sure that projects and even accredited entities are taking gender into account. But part of the problem with that is making sure that it moves beyond sort of the policy documents to the actual implementation. And as an example, in the Green Climate Fund, where there is a strong architecture to ensuring that all of the projects that are implemented are gender responsive, because it's part of the mandate of the Green Climate Fund. We know that the Green Climate Fund is moving with extreme expediency in trying to identify who their accredited entities are and what the projects will be in terms of approving projects. We know that several accredited entities have been approved without a gender action plan or a gender plan and policy being put in place, for example. And although there is a stipulation that before they're able to receive funds, they should have this plan, there's a lot of concern growing that the projects that are being approved and the plans that are and the accredited entities being put forward are not going to really take this into account. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to monitor these spaces. So this demand also includes that women's groups and gender experts must be involved in the impact assessment and tracking utilization of climate finance at all levels. So this is one of the other broad pieces of climate finance. And then finally, and this is a really strong call from the Women and Gender Constituency in particular, and it goes back to the woefully inadequate 100 billion roadmap, is that we need countries and parties to deal with that in a way where they're thinking of new and innovative and mobilizing resources to actually combat environmental and social justice issues. And we use the comparison here of how parties have committed just over $10 billion to the Green Climate Fund in 2015, while, for example, global military spending was calculated at 1.6 trillion. And so we think the urgency and the importance of this climate crisis means countries need to rethink where investments are going and start to commit to a reallocation of funds away from militarization to invest in gender equality, environment, and social justice policies. And so this is really tapping at a more fundamental issue in terms of why there is limited public finance to support climate action, to support gender equality, for example, a lot of which is just that funds are being invested in are not being invested in the kinds of policies that we need them to be. So this is sort of the nitty-gritty of what the financing should look like, how it should be implemented, and also how countries need to think about how finance is generated at a broader level. So I'm going to stop there for a minute to see if there's any questions, or if anybody else from the Women and Gender Constituency who's on the call wants to add any more thoughts to this piece. Kate or anybody else from the constituency, I'd be happy for your comments or thoughts. I don't know if there's any hands that are raised. And I think Kate is, oh, Devi is there. Yes, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead.
Hello? Hi.
Hi, yes.
Sorry, yeah, I was typing before too, and I don't think you can see my chat.
No worries. My question was, does it say like where the financial commitment should go to? Is it just through governments, or is there a mandate for it to reach civil society groups as well?
It depends on, in terms of the Green Climate Fund, for example, the architecture is set up in a way where finance is really flowing or should be flowing from developed to developing countries. And sort of at a mandated level, the flows are really intended to be able to support national level plans, so national adaptation plans and strategies, nationally determined contributions, and climate projects that are happening by, additional stakeholders, multilateral institutions, for example. Within all of that, there's an extremely strong call to make sure that this finance is reaching communities, grassroots, indigenous peoples, for example, and there's lots of different advocacy elements of that. So there's elements of people pushing for a small grants mechanism within the Green Climate Fund, for example, that would ensure funds being made directly to local communities. Indigenous peoples are pushing for a dedicated grant mechanism within the Green Climate Fund. And there are examples of other ways in which people are trying to make sure that this funding is actually reaching local communities, such as we know we have colleagues from the Samdana Institute based in Indonesia who are actually trying to apply for accreditation to the Green Climate Fund in order to be able to facilitate some of the flows of finance that will be coming. And there are a number of people. The challenge with that is it's a very difficult process to become accredited, particularly for a small scale organization or someone who's trying to directly deliver funds to local communities or local NGOs, for example. It doesn't prohibit them from trying, and once, for example, if the Samdana Institute was able to get accredited, they could put forward projects, any project that they deem necessary, to the Green Climate Fund with the authority of, they'd have to work through the national accredited, the national designated authority of that country to say they're putting that project forward. I don't know if that's helpful or based on, or answers your question.
No, it does. I'm just interested to make sure, like what you were saying around it reaching community groups and understanding, the barriers of that too. Thanks.
Great. And in this area, when we look at the events that are happening at COP and the different agenda items, there's a number of opportunities happening that are thinking through climate finance at a broad and at a very specific level in terms of the Green Climate Fund. There's several skill sharing sessions, and there's a master class on finance happening on Gender Day that will look at this as well. Daniela, I see you have your hand raised. I'm just going to unmute you as well.
Hello, do you hear me?
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, but I wrote my question because I'm actually in the middle of I'm going to my university, so there's a lot of noise. Sorry for that. I just wanted to ask, I would like to understand how these demands that you are presenting are going to be presented or introduced in the COP.
Good question. So, yeah. And I'm so sorry, everyone. I seem to just, I'm trying to see why I can't see. Oh, I do see something. Okay, I finally see some questions in the chat box now. Okay, so I see that Kate doesn't have a microphone and they're having technical difficulties, and I understand your question now. So, in terms of the demands, and the question is how we will be introducing these into the COP. There's several pieces to it. So one is that we will create, as you see before us, we're turning this into our key set of demands that we'll be sharing out with different parties and delegates. After we go through this, I'll show you the entry point document that WEDO has created, which actually looks at the different agenda items where some of these issues are being discussed. So for example, later on in the demands, you'll see we have some demands around agriculture and how the discussions on agriculture should be focused, and some of our demands in terms of that. And so part of what this will mean is that we have our broad set of demands, and then when it comes to the session itself, there'll be opportunities to deliver interventions, and we will, so we'll use those opportunities to make statements, and we'll also have bilaterals with certain parties to try to push them on some of the aspects of these demands. We'll also be hosting a press conference to highlight these key demands, and we're doing a number of things. I'll kind of mention them as I go along. We have a few demands around how climate action and climate solutions should be discussed in the COP, and we have a whole project around trying to showcase gender just climate solutions in order to really challenge that narrative. So we do things inside the negotiations to push these demands through bilaterals and interventions, and we also do work outside of the negotiations through advocacy and mobilization and movement building to try to put forward these demands, if that answers your question. Danielle, I think she went on mute again because she's in class.
Sorry,
Okay.
no, I am in the bus. Thank you. That makes everything much clearer.
Okay. So I'm going to move on now to, and these demands we've been, and so I think that the way that they're framed are in areas of finance, implementation, sort of solutions, and then gender equality. So I'm going to move on to what we are seeing as some of our key demands in terms of implementation. And we know that since the Paris Agreement was adopted at Paris and is now going to be entered into force in Marrakech, a big piece of the outcomes of Morocco is the rules and the mechanisms that are going to be put in place to try to ensure implementation of the Paris Agreement. And so we have a number of demands that feed into the discussion around those rules and how parties are starting and countries are starting to think about their commitments that they've made under the Paris Agreement. So in relation to NDCs, which is nationally determined contributions, we have this demand that's part of a broader agenda we have alongside a number of other constituencies to ensure that the implementation and reporting on nationally determined contributions is undertaken in a holistic manner, taking into account all the principles of the preamble of the Paris Agreement, as well as targets under the Sustainable Development Goals. And we recognize here that only 64 of the 190 intended contributions to date have included a reference to women or gender, have recognized women's rights or gender equality. And all of the 64 countries that have done it are non-Annex 1 or developing countries. And so this is the nationally determined contributions, which we went through in the first webinar, is what countries have put forward to try to cut what their plans are and their commitments are to cutting carbon emissions. And in order to meet those nationally determined contributions, countries will now start to develop low emissions pathways and strategies, for example. And part of what we fought for last year in the Paris Agreement, alongside Indigenous peoples and trade unions, was this paragraph which was about ensuring protecting and promoting human rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples, a just transition of the workforce and decent work, intergenerational equity, environmental integrity, and gender equality. And so because those principles are captured in the preamble, part of the request here, as we know, countries will be putting forward their plans and policies for implementing the NDCs, and they will be reporting on their progress, and we want to make sure that those principles are taken into account fully in how they put forward these strategies, and also in the reporting requirements that they have in terms of the activities they're undertaking. And similar to this, I'm going to kind of skip down the piece on the NDCs. We have several kind of thematic areas that we want to make sure are part of implementation. So as countries are thinking about developing their national strategies and plans, we want them to think about things in specific ways. So when we're talking about agriculture, and agriculture is an agenda item under the climate negotiations, for the constituency, it's really important that when we discuss agriculture in terms of implementation, that we are promoting a shift away from industrial food systems and livestock farming to really localized agroecological based food systems in the hands of smallholder farmers, including women, really looking to deliver food sovereignty, and as well as ensuring women's access to productive resources and land tenure rights, in terms of how to deal with and adapt to climate change. And I think this is a really important piece. It's something that comes up time and again with the women that work as part of the constituency and the women's groups that work in different communities, on the importance of really understanding agriculture as the challenge that it poses to the causes of climate change in terms of unsustainable practices, and how to recapture and to promote sustainable development through changing those and shifting food systems away from large-scale industrial agriculture, and really honing in on the ecological practices that are already being done in many communities, and trying to replicate that in other spaces. We are thinking about water in terms of how national policies are created, recognizing water security and the fact that water is as a recognized human right, that this needs to be a central discussion at COP22, really given the nexus that we see between women, water, energy, and food security. And really this thinking about NDCs and that countries will be putting forward plans and policies that demand that countries undertake extensive environmental impact and social assessments, particularly from a gender lens, before, for example, approving any dams or transboundary intercountry water management projects between countries, or among countries, sorry, that needs to be rewritten, which can have, as many of us know, very serious ramifications for women's lives and livelihoods, particularly Indigenous women. So water, whether it's thinking about the amount of water taken up by large-scale infrastructure projects, or projects that deal with water as an energy source, this has been a huge space of conflict among communities across developed and developing worlds, countries, and so it needs to be a point of discussion, and particularly in relation to how these policies and plans are being developed. And similarly, that health and an understanding of the gender norms and relations in terms of health, how it needs to be taken into account when determining climate change risks and vulnerabilities, and also the impacts of climate change in terms of psychological, behavioral, and socially constructed influences. So really thinking about some of the aspects of implementation around agriculture, water, and health. And of course, intertwined within that is a very strong focus on land and land rights. And so just to round out some of our thoughts on implementation, I'm just going to move down to this idea of consultation and consent. So the constituency feels strongly about countries coming together on a clear set of rules to ensure public participation, access to information, consultation, and consent on the implementation of the NDCs. And so all of these demands really come back to the fact that we know countries have agreed to a certain temperature pathway, keeping warming under 1.5 degrees. We know that countries will embark now on putting forward low emissions development strategies and coming up with policies that help to meet potentially those commitments, or they should be putting forward policies to meet those commitments. And we need to make sure that in all aspect of that there is consultation and consent with local communities, gender experts, and women's groups on the design of these strategies. And there's a call here for a better institutionalization across different mechanisms of civil society engagement to ensure that what we have in the UNFCCC, where women, trade unions, farmers, indigenous peoples have a coordinated voice to speak and raise concerns, is also replicated in other mechanisms. We have demands around the global stocktake. So one of the things that will be discussed at the upcoming COP is this global stocktake, which is the moment in which parties are assessing progress made and challenges faced by countries in actually implementing and meeting their nationally determined contributions. And so for us, again, this is about calling to make sure that they're not just reviewing whether or not they've made progress in reducing emissions, but whether they've made progress in also achieving or protecting human rights, the rights of indigenous peoples, promoting gender equality, and that in these spaces where, in the global stocktake, where if there's clear emissions gaps and there's clear barriers that countries are having to implementing their low emissions development strategies, if these barriers arise, for example, from trade regulations that prevent countries from taking climate action, which we know we've seen in cases before. There's been a case in Ottawa, for example, where they put forward a policy that 80% of their renewable energy infrastructure would come from local municipalities and local production, and that was told to be a policy not in line with WTO regulation, for example. So, we want countries to really think in that global stocktake of what are the macroeconomic barriers to actually having countries implement policies that will support them reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. And then here we're talking about an ambition mechanism. So when we see the outcome of the global stocktake, that we recognize how current commitments are not leading us to the temperature pathway that was agreed at the Paris Agreement, and come up with a very clear ambition mechanism to urgently close that gap, particularly by commitments from developed countries. I've said a lot there, so I have a few other pieces. I wanted to stop and see if there are any questions on the pieces that I just discussed, or any comments or additions people would like to add. And then let me see if I found that questions box again. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. I think I see one hand raised. I've just unmuted you. Please go ahead. I think it's Chara. Chara?
Hi, now you do.
How are you?
Sorry. I wanted just to say, first of all, this is really useful. I'm taking notes like crazy, and I wanted to thank you. And secondly, this is not directly related to what you're saying right now, but I didn't receive the recording of the first webinar. I was wondering if you are going to have the recording on this one, because I'm sure that I missed some pieces of information, and it would be amazing for me to listen again all this another time. And I wanted to thank you, because this is really helping me, and I'm really grateful. Thank you again.
That's great. We're very happy to hear that. And yes, the recording from the first one is available now. It has not been shared out yet because it was taking a little bit of time for the recording to process. But the intention, and I'm recording this now as well, so the intention is that this will be shared, if not this evening, then by tomorrow, so that everyone has both last week's discussion and then this week's as well.
Thank you very much, then, and that's great. Thank you again.
Great.
Oh.
So I'm just going to make sure.
One last
yes,
thing.
Please, go ahead.
Sorry. The documents that you're showing. Is it possible to have it on WEDO's website, or is something that you didn't share yet because maybe it's an internal document?
We're finalizing this document in the next day or two. So we've been having sort of discussions internally with the Women and Gender Constituency. So this is the demands of the entire constituency. So we've been working together to come up with and finalize these demands. They're in a final stage right now. We're just making a few text edits here and there, as I said. And so this should be available on the constituency website by Friday.
Oh, amazing. Thank you very much again.
Great. So I'm just going to head back up to, I'm sorry, my computer is a little delayed, but again, in line with implementation, there were two that I skipped over. One is a demand that we have along the lines of fossil fuels. And so this is a strong call from the constituency to demand that, COP22 be the space where developed countries commit to immediately halting all new investment in fossil fuels and provide a very clear and urgent phase out and shift from a fossil fuel-based economy. So we really want to see from countries some forms of commitments, because we know what the science has told us in terms of how much of the current fossil fuel reserves and investments that we currently have that we can burn to actually meet the target that has been set under the Paris Agreement, and we know that it's none. And so we think that this is really the space where parties have to show that they have a clear commitment to this. And we're very clearly here talking about having alongside this immediate halt of all new investment in fossil fuels, very clear phase-out strategies and plans from developing countries on how they will be also phasing out fossil fuels, but very much in recognition of, the developmental needs of developing countries, and that particularly a shift from a fossil fuel-based economy, that this is a really clear issue of climate justice and an issue in which developed countries have to take the lead and have to take the immediate steps in terms of halting fossil fuel investment and have the potential to do that, particularly in certain industries right away. One of the other pieces that we'll be following very closely is the development of this and what has been called a sustainable mechanism. So going into the Paris Agreement, the Women and Gender Constituency had a strong stance of not wanting to see market-based mechanisms as part of the Paris Agreement. The mitigation piece of the Paris Agreement did include the articulation of a new sustainable development mechanism. And there might be others on the call who would like to go a bit more into detail on how these mechanisms are set up, but often they're mechanisms which allow for carbon offsetting. And as a constituency, we really feel that the logic behind carbon offsetting is one that moves us away from achieving true sustainable development and actual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And more than anything, previous market-based mechanisms that have been developed under the UNFCCC, like the Clean Development Mechanism, have really failed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They failed in terms of the goals the objectives of the convention itself, and have in a number of cases caused human and women's rights violations as well as other environmental problems. So we know that there has been a sustainable development mechanism put in or mandated under the adoption of the Paris Agreement, and they'll start to articulate what the SDM, if you will, looks like at this COP. So we are trying to make sure that it takes on a transformative approach to move away from the offsetting logic, and that it's designed in a way that includes binding obligations to respect human rights, gender equality, the rights of indigenous peoples, and environmental integrity. So this is a specific agenda item that we'll be following really closely. So I'm going to move into one other aspect before kind of then taking on as a kind of specific agenda item of the COP. We have these two kind of demands in relation to climate solutions. Sorry, there's three. And this is very much in reaction to the fact that there's a very dominant narrative in the UN climate negotiation space in really lieu of having clear targets and clear commitments from parties, or not in lieu of, we do have commitments from parties, obviously, in relation to their mitigation actions and their what they intend to reduce in terms of GHG or greenhouse gas emissions. But we know that there's a huge gap in terms of the urgency of the problem and the carbon emissions and the carbon budget that's basically been put forward by countries. And so there's this very dominant narrative of other solutions, so solutions that are between countries, or even more so that emphasize the importance of public-private partnerships, for example. And it's an interesting narrative that it's not just something that's spoken about, it's actually been institutionalized through what's called the Global Climate Change Action Agenda. And there's a history of this sort of from 2014. Many of you might remember that there was a large climate summit that was put on by the UN Secretary General in New York. Around the same time that the climate summit happened, there was a huge march in New York, the People's Climate March. And all of this was about generating optimism and ambition around climate action. And that was prior to the Lima negotiations, which were COP20 right before Paris. And these solutions sort of became part of this Lima to Paris action agenda, or the LPAA that people were calling it. And it was, parties very much liked having this sort of solutions-based action agenda that was focused on projects, focused on large-scale infrastructure projects that they could promote and that they could see and package as part of the overall climate action that was being discussed within the UNFCCC. The challenge for the Women and Gender Constituency has been that often these projects are extremely top-down. They're very much focused on large-scale infrastructure projects, and not necessarily on projects that promote long-term sustainable development, that promote gender equality, that ensure human rights. And of course, one of the bigger challenges for us is that there's an overemphasis on the transformative role of the private sector in putting forward these projects, whereas we feel it's critically important for states to play the role of regulators in terms of putting forward regulations for protecting human rights and the environment. And a lot of these projects aren't being done in that vein. We have put forward, for example, a number of different solutions into the original climate summit, and we're told that they were too small, not to scale. And it's really sort of a challenge of the way, a larger framing of thinking about challenging climate, or challenging the combating climate change to ensure we can keep up business as usual, as opposed to having a really deep conversation about how we need to change some of our broader systems and the way in which we approach these solutions within our societies. So these three are very much in relation to that, these demands. And when we send these out, we're actually reframing them so that they'll be in this order and grouped in these key areas. Oh, sorry, I just have to, it's in the wrong place. Excuse me, my computer has just frozen. Just one more second. There we go, up at the top. The Global Climate Change Action Agenda. And so for those of you who are going to Morocco, you will hear a lot about this Global Climate Change Action Agenda. You'll hear about the Global Champions, which are two champions who have been assigned to taking forward and providing a roadmap for this Global Climate Change Action Agenda. There are events happening every day under different themes like transport, buildings, I think land, oceans, and all of these will be about showcasing solutions in all of these areas. So what we've set as a demand is that all actions or solutions promoted under this agenda must be reviewed to ensure they protect, promote, and fulfill human rights, including women's rights and the rights of indigenous peoples, respecting traditional knowledge and collective actions, and that we oppose the continued narrative of the transformative role of the private sector and demands countries to play a regulatory role against private interests in ensuring we achieve climate justice. And this is a really important piece for us because, we very much think that one of the largest challenges that we have to actually promoting sort of systemic change that would promote climate justice is the inability to challenge this dominant narrative of the transformative role of the private sector, and it's very much challenged in a way that, of course, we fully understand the private sector plays a role, but that there's sort of that this role is put up above and beyond the role that local communities, indigenous peoples, and different societies and national state government in itself plays in terms of trying to figure out how we develop solutions in a collective way that actually promotes public interest, and a misunderstanding that regardless of good intention, that the overwhelming bottom line of all private interest is to make profit, and that one of the main challenges that our global community is facing is that we're living in a world where profit is put before people and planet. And so we think this is a really critical piece that we have to have a very frank conversation around, and we have to make sure that the solutions that are being put forward are not just maintaining business as usual. And then in this similar vein, in terms of thinking about how actions are being articulated in the UNFCCC space, we have two other pieces around this. So solutions must strive to be gender just. So we've worked as a constituency to try to, in order to challenge this narrative, develop a set of criteria for what would make a project gender just. And this for us includes ensuring equal access to benefits in all areas of the energy value chain, for example, that projects are designed to alleviate rather than add to women's workload. We've seen a number of projects that tend to instrumentalize women's work and doesn't deal with sort of the underlying power relations, and often can entrench and just add to the burdens of women's workload. That it empowers women via enhanced accessibility, livelihood security, food security, health and safety. It ensures decision-making in all levels by local women and men, women's groups, cooperatives, and communities. and that it enhances and promotes women's democratic rights. And we also have a series of criteria in the fact that the types of solutions that should be put forward should be decentralized and community owned, and that they should really include a low input of resources, for example. And the second piece of this is that we feel that solutions really need to promote, both at a national and a community level, promote energy democracy. So really to move us away from top-down market-based approaches for energy distribution and control over natural resources to making energy something that communities, including women, have control over their own systems and their own resources. This is something that people are discussing a lot in terms of how do you challenge large-scale products that often come in, and these can be both sort of dirty energy, if you will, projects, fossil fuel industry projects that are kind of dropped into communities that take land away from entire communities, from indigenous peoples, from women in particular. But they can also be, for example, large-scale renewable energy projects that kind of get put in place without generating benefit or economic opportunity for local communities, that aren't done in consultation with them, and then really are failing to actually provide sustainable opportunities or sustainable development to local communities or countries in itself. Some of the challenges you see in large-scale multilateral projects that are put forward to create energy access are, as for example in Africa, are often, one example that we have of this is the Power Africa, which is a large-scale initiative by the U.S. government to bring energy access to countries in Africa. But the challenge with that is the stipulation is that this is about enticing foreign direct investments, so foreign companies, U.S. companies, to come into Africa and set up these energy infrastructure projects, which in the end is not promoting local ownership, energy democracy, and really kind of putting the ownership of natural resources into the hands of other countries and other communities. So it's one of the main issues that we are trying to change how we discuss energy distribution, control, and ownership in the climate space. So those are the broad demands. Before we kind of talk specifically about gender equality and how it's framed in the negotiations, these for us are some of the critical issues at a broad level that we see are key demands that we want to bring into all of the different discussions happening at the UNFCCC, whether it's in specific agenda items or if it's in mobilizations, outside spaces, side events. The Women and Gender Constituency will be hosting a 2-week exhibition space in the green zone, which is the more public zone, to highlight what these gender just solutions look like. We'll have several awards. We have an award ceremony where we're going to be showcasing some key projects that we think are exemplify this gender just climate solutions narrative. We'll be having press conferences. So a lot of the key advocacy work that we're going to be doing, and we're hoping to join with many of you in doing, is really trying to challenge a number of different kind of broad ideologies and narratives that frame the climate space. So are there any questions around any of these things that have been put forward? Even challenges or different ideas, things that people feel are missing. I'm going to see if there's any hands raised. I see. I'm not sure, Chara, if your hand is from before or if you have another question, but you're not muted, so please feel free if you had something to add or if there was anyone else.
I'm raising another question.
Yes, please go
I
ahead.
never thought about how sorry, I never thought about how a massive infrastructure energy project, even if it's in clean energy, could actually, in a way, damage local communities. I think I missed a point about that. So basically, the reason why these kind of projects in a way hurt communities is because even if it's for clean energy, is the government or another country that is taking over and is taking away from them their ownership and their access to energy. Is this the issue basically?
Yeah, yeah, and there's a paper that I can also share with everyone here that WEDO recently inputted into alongside ActionAid and Friends of the Earth Scotland, which is about, it's called Power for the People, and it's trying to put forward some key principles of creating energy democracy and showcasing in a number of different cases where perhaps the projects should have been handled differently. And for example, the idea of you know, putting in place renewable energy projects in different communities and places around the world, it really requires extremely holistic consultation within countries and across different constituencies and groups in order to have you know, to develop a type of project that really benefits the area that it's being developed. What you'll have, and you'll see a lot of projects that are put forward in the name of sustainable development, and that often they need to, you know, they take the land away from communities that have been using that land for a number of years. And one example in this publication that I'll share with you is the example of a wind farm that was put in place in Costa Rica, and they needed to access a lot of land in order to put forward this wind farm. And the discussions with the local communities, they did have discussions with the local communities on this, but the compensation provided was really in terms of, you know, relocation of those people, and they provided, I think, a school and education opportunities. So there was consultation to say, you know, in return for this land, here's some relocation monies, here's a school, and here's education, for example. But I think 20 or so years down the line, not 20, I think it was 15 years, they had consultation with the community, and there was a feeling that the benefits that were generated were very short term, and so years after, the energy that was being produced by that wind farm wasn't necessarily going to actually support the community right around it. The ownership of the land was no longer with the community, and there wasn't the economic opportunities coming from that project were going to the private company that developed the farm, as opposed to developing a different type of model where the community itself was in charge and owned that resource to both generate energy for themselves as well as for communities outside of that. So I think it's thinking about how do you move away from these structures where you have private industry or even national government sort of owning and controlling large-scale resources, if that helps and makes sense. And I think the document, the publication, gives a few other examples which start to, you know, to put these questions forward of how we can best create and shift our energy systems.
Okay, and you said that it is power for the people. Thank you very much. This was really, really helpful. Thank you.
And Daniela, I think you have a question too. Oh, I have to unmute you, sorry.
Hello, yes. I wonder if there are already documents, or I know you're talking about these documents, but I want to know if there we could find ways to understand which countries and companies are promoting those projects you are talking about, both the ones who support the new approaches that include the communities and that are actually sustainable, and those which don't, because I think it will be an easier way to understand like how these things are flowing, how which country actually support, and what are their positions. Thank you.
Yes. So there's a number of different types of publications and resources that are being produced, and actually there's a number of groups have come together to put together a training course on energy democracy, and it's just started. It's an online webinar series that has that just started yesterday, and the intention of that is to try to create a global resource base from different communities and different perspectives to really build up the evidence base that you're talking about. So we have a lot of examples of where sort of development isn't happening in a way that promotes sort of local ownership or control, and which results in sort of exacerbated inequalities. There's a number of examples of that, but there's work being done to try to consolidate examples of new structures, so new systems that are being done in different communities that really promote the kind of the kind of community-owned democracy that we're talking about here. And so I think one thing I can do is share some of the resources when I share out this webinar, some of the initial resources that we've seen. I can also share some mailing lists that I know of that share new ideas on economic systems and showcasing. Really, we talk a lot about this concept of a just transition. So now that we're accepted that climate change is happening and countries have accepted we need to be on a different temperature pathway, how do we ensure that that transition, like I said, promotes a different way of understanding our relationship to the environment, that promotes energy democracy, and that makes sure that women's rights and gender equality is central to that transition. So I can share some of those resources, but I think that's a work in progress as well. Okay. I know that there's a lot of other people on this call who have expertise in this area as well, or who have experience of different projects on the ground that have been challenging to local communities. So I just wanted to see, before moving on to the gender aspects, the specific gender aspects, if there were any other people who wanted to add. I think Yassine, you have your hand raised. I'm going to unmute you. I think you might be muted as well, so if you just press your microphone, I think, yeah, there you go.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Hello. It's okay. I am Yassine Diagne. I work at ENDA Energy Program. I am its officer of all gender activities concerning gender and energy and gender and climate change. You are abording now some very interesting aspects concerning what we are doing on the ground, concerning renewable energy, energy efficiency, because when we talk about gender and climate change in our countries, you say it firstly that NDC is not take into account gender. It is the case of in Senegal. It is not taken into account, but if we go about financing of NDCs, it will be difficult to include some aspects. But concerning gender and energy, it is difficult when we talk about gender and climate change in depending on what we are doing, what we are seeing on the ground. It is very, very difficult to talk about gender and climate change without including energy aspects, because the problem is a very relationship between the poverty, contextual poverty, energy poverty. The other problem is the relation, very even relation between natural resources and gender roles, what women are doing on the ground. And we cannot we focus on other aspects concerning climate change, but the question of adaptation is central on that. My question was, it is the second time I push the button, was if we will have some statement concerning what you are doing. You have some very, very interesting points. If it will be possible to have statement, because me, I will be also, I will stay some days because I will be with the official delegation. Now I have an official badge to participate to some discussion, because it will be important to push on some points that the difference of context is very important, because what we are facing, what women are facing here is, for example, different what they are facing in Asia, in Latin America, etc., etc. For me, it is always interesting, but the discussion we'll have during our forum will permit to go through many aspects. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Yassine. No, and it's great to hear from your perspective as well. And again, I think it is an important question. How do these demands translate into action at the COP itself, and what can we do with them? And I think that there's a few different opportunities. And one space that's really important for that is our caucus meetings every morning. So for those who are from civil society, from 8 a.m. until 9 a.m. every morning, we meet as a constituency to think about the agenda for the day and where there are opportunities to make broad demands. We have different opportunities. We can make technical, interventions into the technical process, and a lot of the interventions will deal with some of the issues we've outlined here as demands. We also have opportunities to, in the past we've done actions. So last year we, for example, had a large action inside the halls, like, in front of the delegates, and calling on this reinvestment away from military spending, for example. Or we had an action that was calling on gender equality to be clearly recognized in the Paris Agreement. So we do everything from developing interventions. We have the opportunity to develop a statement from the women's groups who are participating at the COP. We can work on a statement together. We have press conferences. So I think especially for those who will be there, it will be great to engage with you in the caucus space, to come together and think about opportunities that we have to influence, whether it's having bilaterals with particular governments, or using the media and doing some sort of action where there's lots of opportunity to come together in that way.
Great. It will be very interesting.
Great. So
okay.
The last,
yeah.
Yes, great, Yassine. Thank you. So the last thing I would like to go on to in terms of the of understanding the big issues that we have on our agenda, looking forward to COP22, is the area of gender itself as an agenda item. So in the work on the climate negotiations, as I've shown here, there's fundamental aspects about how we deal with climate change in terms of energy, in terms of land, agriculture, etc., which all are critical to promoting gender equality and women's human rights. So the work we do at the UN FCCC is not solely focused on the word gender, if you will. So there's a lot of things to do, and there's a lot of enabling mandates that need to be put in place in order to ensure implementation and an agreement which actually meets the needs of women and men around the world. But we've also, those of us who've engaged in the UNFCCC space have pushed to institutionalize and really have a strong recognition of gender equality and a space and mechanism for which countries can discuss and understand and elaborate the connections between gender and climate change. It was often very difficult to have gender recognized in the climate change space because the space was seen as a very technical, scientific space. And in recent years, there's been a huge shift, a real paradigm shift in terms of understanding at least the basic intersection between women, gender, and climate change. And we see that, for example, in the fact that there are, whereas before, you know, in like 2009, there was maybe one decision in adaptation that recognized gender equality as important for adapting to climate impacts. And we had one decision which looked at the climate negotiations and tried to mandate enhancing gender balance and women's political participation. And there hadn't really been much gains in terms of that. And so, you know, in recent years, we've seen gender taken into account across all areas of the negotiations in terms of technology, adaptation, capacity building. There's typically a demand that action plans and policies be developed in gender responsive ways, that they take into account gender analysis, that they ensure to include that the boards and bodies being set up have a goal of gender balance, and that they promote women's participation. And so having that set of mandates shows that there's a, you know, a clear shift in understanding of these linkages. Actually seeing those mandates lead to implementation is where we are in terms of the main challenge. And trying to make sure that there is a structure and a mechanism put in place to enhance implementation of gender responsive climate policy is one of the focus areas that we have going into the upcoming COP. So in one sense, there is this reflection on a decision we had in terms of enhancing women's participation and gender balance. And in that aspect, there's been very little progress, which again is a reflection on sort of how sometimes we can have beautiful policies that don't necessarily get translated into action. The other piece that we have is that at COP20 in Lima, recognizing that we had some decisions in different places and different aspects of the negotiations that recognized gender, but that there was a real need for enhanced capacity building on the issue, more knowledge, and better coherence across the different kind of thematic areas to both monitor and track what's happening in terms of gender. The governments came together and they adopted the Lima Work Program on Gender, which was a 2-year work program that included a number of activities of the Secretariat. The Secretariat of the UNFCCC for the first time was able to, or had the mandate to do a review of all of the decisions on gender, where they were, and who was responsible for implementing them. Things that maybe seems like would be common sense, but within the Secretariat, without a mandate for some of this work, it often is not possible for them to take on the those specific items. It included the appointment of a senior gender focal point. It included 2 workshops. So there was a workshop last year which looked at, and this was an in-session workshop with parties and delegates, and that looked at the relationship between gender and technology transfer and development, as well as mitigation. There was a workshop this year that looked at gender in relation to adaptation and capacity building. And parties, knowing that the conclusion of these activities would be up for review at this COP, because the work program was 2 years, there was a conclusion by parties in May of this year that in Marrakech they would review with the view of taking a new decision under this gender and climate change agenda item. And so there's been a set of submissions that I don't have the full number of how many parties and how many observers, but there are submissions that have been put forward, and countries, and including the Women and Gender Constituency as well, have outlined what we would like to see in the next phase of this Lima Work Program. So for the Women and Gender Constituency, what we would like to see is a clear commitment from parties to developing a comprehensive plan of action on gender, which at a minimum, and then here's a list of some of the things that we're looking for, which creates greater coherence among the different thematic areas like finance, technology, and mitigation, and the boards and bodies of the UNFCCC in terms of how they share information, data, and tools and activities on efforts to implement gender-responsive climate policy. Because there are small initiatives happening across a ton of different areas that often aren't being shared, the information isn't being released, and it's not really generating the knowledge base that we need to make sure this is influencing at the national level. We talk about guidelines and capacity building at national level. So we know that the UNFCCC Secretariat will probably engage in a number of capacity building activities to support countries in developing their nationally determined contributions. And we think that that's an important opportunity to make sure that gender is a key topic and an aspect that is integrated into that capacity building. We think the plan should provide for enhanced scientific research on the links between gender and climate change and a strong call for the collection of sex disaggregated data and gender analysis. We want to see progress on ensuring women's full and equal participation in all levels of decision-making around climate change, including reaching the goal of gender balance, not just by committing to it, but actually by providing targeted resources and capacity building efforts to do so. And then there are collaborative efforts amongst the different funds to make sure that climate finance is 100% gender responsive and it's reaching community groups and grassroots women leaders. And then in the context of all of this, we are calling that developed country governments who champion gender equality, because there's a lot of political will at this moment for extending the work of the Lima Work Program. But this really needs to be backed up with the support of financial commitments, because the previous decisions that we've had on gender have included a stipulation that the activities would only be undertaken if the finance is provided. And the Secretariat has put forward an estimation based on the most ideal scenario of a gender action plan of how much money would be needed to implement that. And so we're supporting their call that countries put forward funds to actually be able to implement the Lima Work Program. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of information about sort of how we got to the Lima Work Program that I didn't include or discuss in that overview. But I know a lot of people are interested in this as a decision, and there is a lot of discussion on, you know, what's happening with the Lima Work Program. So I'm interested if there are questions, if anyone would like to add any more details to that, or if people would have any questions in terms of context, for example. Yeah, please go ahead, Chara.
Hi, you mentioned before that there was a first recognition of the importance of human rights and gender equality implementation in 2009. I think I missed a part of the information. It was a decision, it was an article of the agreement in 2009. Could you please give me just a hint where I can find this specific reference?
Yes. So there's two things on this. It wasn't human rights. There was a reference to gender equality in, it was actually COP7 in Marrakech, which was 15 years ago. So 15 years ago at one of the COPs, they took a decision on national adaptation plans of action. So these were being developed by developing countries. And one of the principles of formulating those NAPAs, that they called them at the time, was that gender equality was one of the guiding principles. So that was one of the only references to gender. It was the only reference to gender that had been part of any decision coming out of the UNFCCC. In parallel to that, at COP7 in Marrakech 15 years ago, they also came up with a decision that was aimed at enhancing gender balance and women's participation on the boards and bodies of the UNFCCC. So those were the two decisions that were taken then. And fast forward from COP7 to COP16 in Mexico. It wasn't until COP16 where we had a robust sort of set of decisions around capacity building, adaptation, etc., which started to take gender equality into account in different ways, whether it was through calling for gender experts or analysis. And then that followed up with, in following COPs, for example, the one after that, they took a decision on the design of the Green Climate Fund. So they adopted that they would develop a Green Climate Fund, and as part of the operational guidelines, it was included that all of the funds should be gender sensitive. So we started to see this sort of shift in gender being taken into account across different decisions. There was a decision in COP16 sort of as part of a preamble which made mention of human rights, and it was the first time that that had been taken into account. And there's a lot less references to human rights. Rights language is very difficult to get into the decisions under the UNFCCC. And so the only other articulation of human rights was in the preamble now of the Paris Agreement, which also talks about gender equality. And there's actually an app that WEDO is launching at the upcoming COP, because some of the work that we've done in partnership with the Global Gender and Climate Alliance has been to track all of these references and decisions. And so at the upcoming COP, we're launching an app where you'll be able to find all of these. We have a document right now which lists all of the references, and there's spaces that you can find this, but the app will be available on the web and on your phone, where you could look up, for example, adaptation and find all of the decisions under the climate negotiations that reference gender or women, for example.
This is amazing. There's a way to, sorry, where I can find this document in the meantime, waiting for the app. That is incredible.
The document, I can share it with the webinar. It's on WEDO's website, and it's just called, I think, Gender and Climate, like Gender Mandates in the UNFCCC. I think if you just Google that, you'll find the document. But I can also share it with the email.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Any other questions?
Thank you very much. It was really...
I just wanted to, if there's no questions about the, I mean, maybe just to say on the Lima work program so people understand, the discussions on gender is a specific agenda item, a continual standing agenda item of the COP. So every COP has gender on its provisional agenda, and for the upcoming COP, and typically this agenda item is forwarded to the SBI, which is the subsidiary body on implementation. So there will be negotiations on gender as an agenda item under the SBI in the first week of the COP, and we should know the outcome of those discussions by Saturday of the first week. And there are parties that are already working together to come up with sort of draft text to see what this decision will look like, and the constituency is engaging a lot with different parties, UN Women and other organizations, to try to have bilaterals and to advocate across these areas that we're pushing for. I'm just going to share quickly with you one other document. I'm not going to go through it, but I'm going to just let you know how to use it, and I'll share this as part of the webinar email. I hope you can see this document. This is called a Gender Responsive Climate Policy Entry Points document, and you are going to be negotiating inside this space document. And basically what we've done here is looked at the provisional agenda really challenging is that there's typically several agendas happening in parallel to each other. So at this upcoming COP, there's, I think we'll be meeting through this, but in this document, which I'll share with you, we have some key links. So the overview schedule of the COP22, just the specific site on the UNFCCC where you can find the documents and decisions that you'll need to track. The COP22 host website, which has all of the logistical information you might need. And then I would strongly encourage for anyone who does have access to a smartphone to download the UNFCCC Negotiator app, because it's really useful on site to get up-to-date information on key events that are happening. And also they send alerts when they've uploaded new documents. There's thematic days that are being hosted by the Secretariat each day. Gender Day was one of the first thematic days, and it's being held on Tuesday, November 15th. There's just a number of specific events that will be happening on Gender Day that are hosted by the Secretariat. But of course, for us, that Gender Day is every day. So, but just for you to be aware that this is how each of the agenda items is set up. So we've taken something like COP22. So the COP itself has a particular agenda. We've listed who the key people are in terms of who's leading the COP22 agenda. We provisional agenda here, which is a really good thing to go through to understand. The agenda gets sent to one of the subsidiary bodies, like I said before, the SBI or the SEBSTA. Most of the things highlighted under the COP agenda are like events, high-level events that are happening, an opportunity for like making a statement or intervention. And so this is where, again, in these areas, like a high-level dialogue on climate finance, we'll be working with different constituencies to bring some of our key demands on finance into an intervention and a statement into that space. As just an example. And there are some specific items that we've included this not exactly, I'm not technological science and technological advice. So there's certain agenda items under this. One would be agenda Nairobi work program on impacts and vulnerability and adaptation to climate change. So what we've shared here is, if you were to follow this issue, we've tried to indicate why this might be an issue of interest if you are working, for example, on health or adaptation, indigenous and traditional knowledge. We've listed who the Secretariat contact is for this particular agenda item, who the co-facilitators are for this agenda item, which countries they're from, a little bit of background on what agenda item is health. Health is a really important topic for the Nairobi Work Program. And there was a call for submissions prior to this COP. And so what we've done is gone through party reflected on women or gender. And so that's just one example. And this is a very, and I think that if you're going to the COP yourself, which agenda items you might want to follow or read more about, or just to have an understanding of how some parties are thinking about these issues. The last document I wanted to show you before I'm going to just move to if there's any questions. I don't know where it is. Where did I put you? Okay, it's here. Is a COP22 events on gender document that, again, we will share across, but there's a lot of events that are happening on gender at the upcoming COP. And so this tries to provide an overview of the different spaces. For example, Women and Gender Constituency are myself as a representative of the Global North and my colleague Kalyani from the All India Women's Conference as a representative of the Global South. We as a caucus will have a day in the room Mediterranean, and this is for people who are able to be inside in the blue zone. We will also, as I said, host a daily advocacy meeting from 8 to 10, hopefully in the same room, and that's for members of civil society that want to engage in direct advocacy and thinking through our strategies. On some of the days, we will have thematic days, so we have an African Women's Day, a Trade and Labor Day, a Young Feminist Day, and an Indigenous Women's Day, which we use the caucus from 9 to 10 to hear from those who are representing these different thematic issues. And then a number of our constituency members will also have booths during the time of the conference. November 15th is Gender Day, and the Secretariat has developed an official program for Gender Day, which includes a masterclass on access to finance. So that will be an interesting space where we'll hear from representatives of the different climate financing mechanisms on how to ensure gender is fully taken into account. There's a couple of different events and then a high-level panel, and the Women and Gender Constituency will be hosting press conferences on that day. The rest of this showcases some, as well as other happening in the blue zone. You'll see that there's, a number that are trying to think about the transformative aspects of climate policy to really deliver development justice, promoting climate gender justice. So the demands are trickling into our side events. Be looking at gender green zone, the Women and Gender space from the 7th to the 17th. We did this in Paris. This is going to be an open space. If you are interested, for example, there's opportunities if you're coming and there's something you would like to present on, or you'd like to host a small meeting for a few people, you can use this space. There's a contact in the email, or sorry, in the event document that you can email about that. There'll be a space for video. There's lots of posters being showcased. And there are and just finally, then from the 12th to the 13th, which many of you are attending and are aware of, the Global Gender and Climate Alliance will be hosting. It's open to the public. There's going to be a number of GGCA members there, students, researchers. There's a ton of skills sharing sessions that are happening during that forum. There's an awards ceremony, so that's a really good space for networking and really thinking about implementation of gender responsive climate policy. An event outside the climate negotiations focused on women from the front lines, telling their stories, their solutions, and their there is going to be held a Women Leaders and Global Transformation Summit. This is really a summit being pushed by the organizers, by the government of Morocco, some key groups in Morocco, as well as the the climate champions that I was talking about before. We've been peripherally involved in organizing this space, meaning we've just been made aware that it's happening. And so I can't give you much information about what this summit will be about, but those interested in attending and to get more information, there's a link here that you would have to go to. So that is it. That's officially it. The biggest, these were really just 3 documents that really will help define help define how the Women and Gender Constituency will be approaching the upcoming COP, our broad demands and visions. And of course, within the constituency, we have many members who have expertise in different areas, and they have their own events and their own agendas as well. This is sort of our shared agenda and some tools that we've created to try to help navigate the space. So I'm going to leave it at that and just see if there's any final questions, concerns, additions, comments. Please feel free to share anything or raise a question, etc. And if it's all been answered, that's also okay. I'm sorry again that I promised that after last week that this week would not be me talking the entire time, but unfortunately my colleagues weren't able to contribute because of technology, so you had to listen to me again. So I apologize for that. We had limited time, and a number of our colleagues are already traveling to Morocco and weren't able to join us. So hopefully next time we'll have a much more diverse audience sharing this information. If there's no hands or questions, I think I'm monitoring the question box now, and I don't see anything that has been added. Then I am happy to conclude the call, and I really appreciate everyone who was able to join. We've recorded this, and I will share this alongside the recording from last week and the documents that I mentioned throughout this. And if there's anything that I said I would share that I failed to, please just send an email, and we will try to get that to you. And as I said, these demands will be finalized, and all of these documents that I've shared will be able to be found on the Women and Gender Constituency website. So thank you all, and let's change the world together, and try to demand climate justice and women's rights over the course of the next 2 weeks. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of you and just continuing to work with all of you in different ways. Thank you for joining. Bye.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.